Low income is not just a small paycheck. It is a system that resets your life. You earn, you pay, something breaks, you start over. And the worst part is not the starting over. The worst part is that you were making progress. You were building something. You could feel yourself getting a little ahead. And then one bill, one emergency, one month that ran too long, and all of it vanished. That is not bad luck. That is a loop. And most people never escape it, not because they are lazy, not because they are weak, but because they do not see the structure underneath it. They think the answer is to work harder. They take more shifts. They cut more spending. They push through another year with less sleep and more pressure. And the loop eats that too. Because effort inside the wrong structure does not build anything. It just gives the trap more of your time. This video is not going to tell you to hustle more. It is not going to give you a motivational speech about discipline. It is going to show you the 5 mechanisms that keep low income locked in place, the 5 layers of the loop. And then it is going to give you a protocol for actually breaking out. Not by pretending money does not matter, not by faking positivity, but by understanding clearly how the trap works, so you can stop feeding it. Let me show you how the loop works. There is a lie most people absorb early in life. The lie says, if you work hard enough, you will be fine. And it sounds true. It sounds like something a good person should believe. But it is incomplete. Hard work matters. Nobody serious would deny that. But hard work without understanding the structure you are working inside is just energy poured into a machine that was never designed to let you out. I want you to think about that differently. Think about someone earning just enough to survive. They get up early, they stay late, they skip meals, they take on extra work, and at the end of the year, their savings have barely moved. Not because they are failing, but because the structure around them keeps absorbing every small gain before it can grow. If you applied a Buffett-inspired lens to this, the diagnosis would be clear. It is not enough to work. You must understand the environment your work exists inside, because some environments let effort compound. And some environments eat it before it ever gets the chance. Low income, for most people, is the second environment. And when you are inside it, everything costs more, everything breaks faster, and every attempt to climb gets taxed before it begins. That is not a failure of character. That is a structural problem. And the first step to escaping it is to stop blaming yourself for struggling inside a machine that was built to recycle your effort. Let me show you the 5 traps that keep it running. The first trap is the one nobody talks about honestly. Being broke is expensive. That sounds like a contradiction. It is not. When you have no margin, every system around you charges you more. You cannot buy in bulk because you do not have enough cash for the upfront cost, so you pay more per unit every single week. You cannot pay bills early because your paycheck has not landed yet. So you pay late fees. You cannot afford quality items that last. So you buy cheap things that break, and then you buy them again. Your insurance costs more because your zip code is riskier. Your credit costs more because your history is thinner. Your time costs more because you have to manage 10 small fires that wealthier people pay someone else to handle. This is the scarcity tax. It is invisible on any single day, but across a year, it is devastating. It means that 2 people can earn the same amount, and the one who starts with less will end the year further behind. Not because they spent more foolishly, but because the system extracted more from them automatically. This is not about discipline. This is about friction. Low income does not just limit what you can buy. It raises the price of everything you already need. And the cruelest part is that the scarcity tax is silent. No one sends you a bill labeled poverty surcharge. It just shows up as tighter weeks, shorter margins, and the constant feeling that no matter how carefully you plan, the math never works. That is not your fault. That is the first layer of the loop, and it is already running before you wake up in the morning. But it is not the deepest layer. That comes next. The second trap looks like the solution. That is what makes it so dangerous. When you are stuck in low income, the most obvious move is to work more hours. Pick up another shift, take a second job, say yes to overtime. And on the surface, that works. More hours equals more money. But here is the problem nobody warns you about. Not all hours are equal. Some hours build something. Some hours just get consumed. When you sell your time at a low rate, you are handing over the only resource that could actually change your position. Every hour spent surviving is an hour not spent learning, not building, not developing something that raises the value of your future. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in financial life. Because income does not grow by working more cheap hours. Income grows when the value of your time increases. And the value of your time cannot increase if all of your time is already sold. This is the cheap hour trap. You work harder. You earn a little more. You feel a small sense of progress. But you are standing still because you are trading your most powerful asset, your time, at the lowest possible return, and the structure around you keeps demanding more of it. The trap does not feel like a trap. It feels like responsibility. It feels like effort. It feels like the right thing to do. And that is exactly why most people stay inside it for years without ever questioning whether the hours they are selling are building anything or just keeping the loop fed. You are not lazy for being trapped here. You are doing what the system rewards in the short term. But the short term is where the loop lives. And if your entire strategy is short-term survival, then survival is all you will ever get. That is the second layer. And the third one is the one that breaks people. This is the trap that destroys belief. You have been careful. You have been cutting back. You have been putting a little aside. Maybe it took 3 months. Maybe it took 6. But you finally had a small cushion. Not much, but enough to feel like you were getting somewhere. And then the car broke, or the rent increased, or a medical bill landed, or your hours got cut the same week your phone screen cracked and your kid needed school supplies. And in 1 week, the cushion was gone. All of it. Back to zero. Back to surviving. Back to the same starting line you were standing on 6 months ago. That is the emergency reset. It does not require a disaster. It does not require a crisis. It only requires one ordinary problem at the wrong time. And when you have no margin, every time is the wrong time. This is the layer of the loop that kills motivation. Because after the second or third reset, something inside you starts to whisper. It says, maybe effort does not work for me. Maybe saving is pointless. Maybe I am not the kind of person who gets ahead. And that whisper is not weakness. That whisper is your brain processing evidence. It saw the effort. It saw the sacrifice. It saw the progress disappear. And it drew a conclusion. The conclusion is wrong, but it is understandable. Because the problem was never that you could not save. The problem is that you were saving inside a structure that has no protection against ordinary shocks. And without protection, every reset compounds the emotional damage. It does not just take your money, it takes your belief that trying is worth it. That is the real cost. And once that belief starts to fracture, the fourth trap walks in. This is the trap that gets judged the hardest and understood the least. When your life is a constant state of financial pressure, when every week is tight, every month is a negotiation, every unexpected cost is a threat, your nervous system starts keeping score. It does not care about your budget. It does not care about your 5-year plan. It cares about one thing, relief. And it will find it. A delivery order after a brutal shift. A small purchase that makes the weekend feel less empty. A subscription that gives you something to look forward to. A night out because you cannot face another evening of staring at walls and worrying. None of these are luxuries. None of these are reckless. They are pressure valves. And when someone on the outside looks at your spending and says, well, that is why you are broke, they are not seeing what you see. They are not standing inside the pressure. They do not know what it feels like to be financially squeezed for months without a single moment of breathing room. The dopamine relief trap is not about stupidity. It is about stress biology. Your brain, under sustained financial threat, begins to prioritize short-term relief over long-term strategy. Not because you are broken, because that is what human brains do under chronic stress. The planning part of your brain gets quieter under pressure. The survival part gets louder. The part that says, think long-term, gets drowned out by the part that says, give me relief now. So the spending happens. not because you forgot your goals, but because your body overruled them. And every time it happens, a little more margin disappears, a little more progress gets absorbed, a little more fuel gets pulled out of the engine before it can build speed. This is not a discipline problem. This is a structural problem wearing a discipline mask. The loop does not only take your money, it trains your brain to rent relief. And the people who judge it the loudest are almost always the people who have never had to live inside that level of pressure for more than a week. The point is not shame. The point is mechanism. Once you understand that the relief spending is a stress response, you can start designing around it instead of just hating yourself for it. But before we get to the protocol, there is one more trap, and this one operates on a different timeline. This is the quietest trap, and the most expensive. Every strong financial life eventually depends on one principle: compounding. Small amounts, repeated consistently, growing over time. That is how savings become security. That is how skills become leverage. That is how effort becomes something that works even when you are not pushing. But compounding requires one condition that the poverty loop does not allow. It requires something to survive long enough to grow. Inside the loop, nothing survives. Every dollar gets consumed. Every skill gets interrupted. Every plan gets reset before it has time to take hold. And so nothing compounds. Not your money. Not your ability. Not your options. This is the compound void. It is the absence of accumulation. And it is the most dangerous layer of the loop because it does not feel like anything while it is happening. You do not feel compounding fail. You just feel stuck. You feel like time is passing and nothing is changing. You feel like other people are pulling ahead while you keep running in place. And the reason is not that they are smarter or more talented. The reason is that they live on the side of the line where things compound. The wealthy live on the side where money compounds. The trapped live on the side where problems compound. Same principle, opposite direction. And every year you spend inside the void, the distance between those two sides grows wider. Not because you are falling, but because compounding is pulling them forward while the loop holds you in place. This is where the real damage happens. Not in one bad month, not in one emergency, but in the quiet accumulation of years where nothing was allowed to grow. A Buffett-inspired principle would frame it this way. The most important variable in building wealth is not the size of the investment. It is the length of time it is allowed to compound without interruption. Inside the poverty loop, interruption is not the exception. It is the system. And escaping it requires more than motivation. It requires a protocol. Now, we rebuild. But not the way most advice tells you to. Most advice assumes you have margin. It assumes you have time. It assumes you have a stable base to build from. You do not. So the protocol has to start differently. It has to start inside the loop, while the loop is still running. That means the first move is not growth. The first move is to stop the bleeding. Look at your last 90 days of spending, not to judge it, to diagnose it. Find the single biggest recurring leak. Not the emergency, not the rent, not the groceries. The one cost that repeats every month, that you barely notice, that quietly pulls margin out of your life before you can use it. A subscription you forgot about. A convenience purchase that became a habit. A recurring payment that made sense once but does not anymore. Find it. Cut it. Not because it will make you rich, but because the first act of breaking the loop is proving to yourself that you can change the structure, even by one small move. That is move 1. Move 2 is harder. Protect your time, not all of it, not some impossible morning routine. Protect 1 honest hour per week. That is it. 1 hour where you are not surviving. 1 hour where you are not putting out fires. 1 hour where you are building something, learning a skill, studying a trade, researching one path that could raise the value of your time. 1 hour per week does not sound like much, but inside the poverty loop, it is a revolution. Because that 1 hour is the first thing in your life that is not being consumed. It is the first seed that gets planted instead of eaten. Start with 1 hour a week, then expand it when you can. 20 minutes a day if that works better. The exact shape does not matter. What matters is that something in your life is finally being protected from the loop. Move 3 is the hardest one emotionally. Cut one dopamine pattern. Not all of them. Not the ones keeping you sane. 1. The one you already know is draining you. The one that gives you 15 minutes of relief and 3 days of regret. You already know which one it is. You do not need me to name it. Cut it. Replace it with something that costs nothing and gives you even 10 minutes of genuine rest. A walk, a stretch, silence. Anything that lets your nervous system calm down without your wallet opening. This is not about becoming a monk. This is about removing one feed line from the loop so there is a little less fuel going into the machine that keeps resetting you. Move 4 is where the math starts to change. Build the smallest possible buffer, not an emergency fund. That sounds too big inside the loop. A buffer. 1 week of breathing room. Enough that one surprise does not reset everything. If you can protect even a small amount each month, even an amount that feels embarrassing, you are doing something radical. You are breaking the emergency reset. You are putting a thin wall between your life and the next shock. And that wall does not need to be thick. It just needs to exist. Because the difference between zero margin and a little margin is not a matter of degree. It is a different world. Zero margin means every problem is a crisis. A small buffer means some problems are just problems. That shift changes everything. Move 5 is the long game. Raise the value of your time, not by working more hours, by making each hour worth more. That means skill. One learnable, sellable, improvable skill that the market rewards and that you can build during that one protected hour each week. Not a fantasy skill, not something that sounds impressive on the internet. Something real, something that, in 6 months or a year, makes your time more valuable than it is today. Because the cheap hour trap only breaks when the hours stop being cheap. And the hours stop being cheap when you bring something to the market that is harder to replace. A skill is not just a way to earn more. It is a way to become less replaceable in a world that treats replaceable people cheaply. That is the protocol. Stop the bleeding. Protect 1 hour. Cut one relief pattern. Build a thin buffer. Raise the value of your time. None of these are fast. None of these are glamorous. But every single one of them is a direct strike against one layer of the loop. And when even 2 or 3 of these moves are working at the same time, something shifts. The resets slow down, the margin grows. And for the first time, something in your life is being allowed to compound. Let me be honest with you. If you are living inside this loop right now, nothing I have said will fix it overnight. There is no speech that erases debt. There is no framework that replaces income by morning. But what I hope this video gave you is something most financial advice never offers. A diagnosis. Not a lecture. Not a guilt trip. Not a list of tips that assume you already have what you need. A clear look at the machine that has been running underneath your life. The scarcity tax was charging you more for having less. The cheap hour trap was consuming your time before it could build anything. The emergency reset was erasing your progress before it could take hold. The dopamine relief trap was draining your margin through a stress response you were never taught to see. And the compound void was making sure that nothing in your life had enough time to grow. That is not a character flaw. That is a system. And now that you can see it, you do not have to keep feeding it blindly. You are not broken. You are not lazy. You are not behind because you deserve to be. You are behind because the loop was designed to keep you there. And escaping it does not require some dramatic reinvention. It requires small, strategic, protected moves, repeated long enough that they start compounding instead of getting consumed. The goal is not to look rich. The goal is not to impress anyone. The goal is to stop being reset. Because once the resets stop, even small progress starts to build. And progress that builds is a completely different life than progress that keeps disappearing. If this kind of calm, long-term financial thinking is what you are looking for, stay with this channel. This is the work we are doing here. Not hype, not shortcuts, structure, diagnosis, and the quiet discipline to build something the loop cannot take from you. Your next move is not dramatic, it is honest. Find the leak, Protect the hour, build the buffer, and let the compounding finally begin.